White balance is one of those settings that you'll find both in your camera and inside Adobe Lightroom. If you're shooting in RAW, you can actually edit your white balance later. That means you don't have to focus on getting it absolutely perfect in your camera. This is personally how I like to shoot. I typically shoot in auto white balance on my camera, one less thing to worry about, and I can focus instead on the composition and the exposure, which really is much more important. And I can change the white balance later when I come to edit my photos. This is also partly because I typically only ever publish one photo from a shoot. So for me, I only need to edit one photo, or I'll edit a bunch if I'm giving them to other people, but I can copy a lot of these settings over. So white balance, why do we need it and why is it so important? Well, there's two ways we can use it. The first way is to get an accurate color reproduction. That means that your whites are whites, your yellows are yellows, your greens are greens, and to use it creatively. That's the second way. You can adjust the white balance for a more creative look in your photograph. So let's get started here in Adobe Lightroom Classic CC, and then we'll look at Adobe Lightroom CC, and I'll show you the different ways that you can control white balance. Come over here to the top of the develop panel and you'll see we have a white balance section. There is two sliders, temperature and tint. Temperature is quite obvious. Do we want the photo to look cold? Do we want the photo to look warm? And then the tint is different variations of green through to purple. We'll reset this for now. You also have a drop down up here. We can have as shot, which is what your white balance will be set to out of the camera. Next we have auto white balance. So this isn't to be confused as the auto white balance in your camera. Your camera will have an auto white balance and so will Adobe Lightroom. Adobe Lightroom is looking at the scene and deciding for itself what it thinks the white balance should be when you select auto. And then there's daylight, cloudy, shade, tungsten, fluorescent flash, and custom. All things you'll be used to when you're setting the white balance inside your camera. I always leave it on as shot, and then I'll come and adjust the temperature slider, pretty much only ever the temperature slider if I'm not happy with the white balance of my photo. We also have a color picker over here, and this allows us to find a neutral color in the scene. So what we're technically looking for here is an 18% gray. I'm not going to go into the technical details of why this is, but this is what you have when you pick up a white balance card. You see these little gray cards that photographers shoot with? That is 18% gray. Then they can come into the photo later and they can go and pick on that white balance card with this picker tool, and they can select the gray that they know is going to have an 18% gray, and then Adobe does a little bit of magic and works out what the white balance should be. We're trying to make our whites white, remember that. So by using a gray instead of a white and an 18% gray, we eliminate the possibility that the area could be overexposed. If you used a white card and there's direct light on that white, that might be overexposed, and then Adobe's not going to be able to work out the white balance based on that card. So we use an 18% gray for that. I said I wasn't going to go into it, but why not? So one way we can do this is we can go around this image and we can find a very light gray and select this with our color picker. So maybe over here, and that's going to give us a white balance, which is a little bit cooler than it was before. But there's a couple things you should know about this color picker. First of all, if you don't like this little loop that comes up, you can turn this off down here. You see it disappears. You can also change the scale. So maybe you want to have lots of tiny little pixels, or you can have very few large pixels like so. And then there's also, and this is something I do recommend you try, the auto dismiss function. So I can select this, which is automatically selected by default, and then whenever I select an area on the scene, it sets the white balance and it's done, it's set. If, however, you turn this off, you can keep selecting different white balance options until you find one you like. I actually really like this one. So you can continue to click and experiment by turning off auto dismiss, something I do recommend you try. But let's get down to the purpose of white balance. We've mentioned it already that you need to have an accurate color reproduction in your scene, but really it comes down to personal taste. You know, what do you want your scene to look like? For the most part, you want it to look accurate. That's kind of a given. You want it to look accurate. And by looking at a scene just with your eye, you can tell, does this look like how it's supposed to look? Do these whites look white enough? Do these blues look with the correct amount of blue? They're not too cold. Is the sky too warm? Is it too cold? You can do that just by looking at the scene. Using a color picker is great for experimenting, but ultimately I'll come into a scene and I'll just adjust it based on what I think it should look like. And maybe I keep it a little bit cooler or maybe a little bit warmer based on the weather. But in this scene, I know this was shot, I think this was shot in January. So looking at the scene, I'm thinking, well, it's probably a little bit cooler. So maybe I want it around here, but I think that's even still a little bit warmer than the as shot. Yeah, it is a little bit warmer. So I think it wants to be a little bit warmer than it was. And after that, I don't really need to think too much about my white balance. So I've started off here with a photo that had a good white balance. We'll get into creative uses of white balance in just a moment. Let's move through to a second photo example here. So this is Tokyo. I shot it out of the Metropolitan Tower and big expansive views of the city. But right now, if you look at this scene, it's really hard to tell what the light was in that scene because the white balance is maybe okay, but it does look quite blue. So what happens if we make it a little bit warmer? Well, now it looks a little bit too warm. So do we continue to experiment with different temperatures until we found one that we like? Because it's quite a monotone image. You look at everything's blue here, and if I push it here, everything's orange. It's really quite monotone. So what am I going to do? Well, for this, I would probably experiment with the color picker. I'm going to turn off auto dismiss, and I'm just going to find areas in the scene that I think, well, actually I'm doing this randomly. I'm just going to do it until I find one that I like. I think that actually looks really nice to have that warm sunset look. And we have these warm lights from the street, as we know anyway. And you can continue to experiment. But that's the great thing about the color picker tool, is it allows you to do this as much as you like. So this is a scenario where you might want to get a little bit more creative. Now let's move on to a scene where we are going to get creative with the white balance. So this, as far as I can tell with my human eye looking at the scene, it is an accurate white balance. It looks great. The colors look beautiful. The blues aren't too blue. The oranges aren't too orange. But this is also a sunset photo. And what do we associate with the sunset? Well, big, bright, orange, glowing skies. So maybe what I want to do in this scenario is to push this so it's a little bit warmer. And I could push it there, and now we have a warmer sunset. And that's quite a big difference. That's from 5,000 Kelvin to 8,000 Kelvin. We can also use an adjustment brush. Now, we'll go into more detail on adjustment brushes in another video, so I won't go into it greatly here. But I'm going to put this, and I'm going to invert it. This is a radial filter. I'm going to put this onto the sky over here. I'm going to reset the exposure, and I'm just going to make that area of the sky a little bit more orange. And now we can push this much further without having to affect the rest of the photo. And we have a more orange glow to that sky. And I think that looks great. So that's a quick before and after here. That's the after and that's the before. A very subtle change, but it really helps to add a strong sunset to that photo. And lastly, we have a shot of the Milky Way. This is me in Joshua Tree. I'm standing on this arch here. This was one of the nights that we shot the Milky Way Mastery course. And for this sort of scenario, we're looking to have a really cold sky. We want the sky to look blue and purple because that's what the Milky Way looks like. And in this scenario, I've pushed it really, really far. And this is where we start to get a little bit more creative because, okay, I actually don't want any real green in the scene. I want to push it more purple because we have purple up in here in the stars. So this is just another scenario where you might want to be a little bit more creative, but white balance becomes really important here. If you don't have the right white balance, you'll see that you start to lose some of the color and definition. So around here looks really good. Up here we can see we have some purple, and over here we have some blue. But if I push this too far to the blue, everything turns blue, and we don't want that. So I'm going to keep it around here. So that's white balance inside Adobe Lightroom CC, or Classic CC rather. Let's have a look now in Adobe Lightroom CC. To find white balance, you're going to come over here to the right-hand side and open up color, and you have temperature and tint. You also have the drop down here, and you have the color picker. Now the color picker isn't unfortunately as good in this version because we don't have those options for the auto selector, and we don't have the options to change the loop view or anything like that. So when you go and select on this image like so, the auto select is off by default, which is great, but if you want it on, you don't really have a choice of that. Not a huge thing to worry about. It's not going to change the end result. It's just a different user experience. And you do basically the same thing. You can adjust the temperature and the tint up here on the right hand side underneath color. So that's white balance inside Adobe Lightroom. If you have any questions, please leave me a comment, and thanks for watching.